On the information side of the structure plane, we have information architecture. Information architecture, or IA, is all about the organization, grouping, ordering, and presentation of content. What's the content? How much of it is there? How's it going to be organized? What are we going to call it? And what's its order of importance and priority to the person on the receiving end? So information architecture is all about organizing, categorizing, prioritizing. Information architecture is the creation of organizational and navigational schemes. Okay, we're figuring out the ways in which people move through information and what's going to make sense to them. A good IA allows people to move through that content efficiently and effectively. But it's about a lot more than just finding content. It's also about educating, informing, and persuading. And often those things happen in very equal doses. It's not just about, sort of exposing it. It's about teaching people what it is and how it's organized, right? Setting expectations and then meeting those expectations. And sometimes it is about persuading, right? It's about motivating a person to take a specific action. An effective IA is flexible. It accommodates growth. It adapts to change, much in the way that the physical structure of the site or the app adapts to change. Information is the same way. When you set categories and say, here are the buckets of information, this is what we're going to call things, these are our main areas of categorization, you want them to be the types of things that are going to have a long shelf life as the product evolves. There are multiple ways to organize information, but primary and most obvious method is hierarchy. A hierarchy pattern is essentially a very standard site structure with an index page and a series of subpages. It's the model that most websites are based on. It's very good for organizing very complex structures that resemble like a desktop site or a system structure. It makes sense when there's a lot of complexity and it has to be very strictly organized in order for us to be able to get through all of it. The issue is that multifaceted structures like this can prevent a problem to people using a small screen, simply because they can't see all this depth, all these areas. With a hierarchy pattern, you typically have a high volume of content and a high degree of organization. So there's multiple tiers. There's a primary level, a secondary level, a tertiary level, et cetera, et cetera. And on a small screen, it's really difficult to see sort of the breadth and width or even depth of all your options. We can also use a hub and spoke pattern, which is a very typical setup for software, definitely, for mobile applications, where you start with a very central location, you bounce out to do something, and then you come back to that central location. So what we're doing is we're providing a central index. The person navigates out from that index, and then they come back. The constraint here is that users can't navigate from one spoke to the other. They always have to go back to the hub. This is really good for multifunctional tools where sort of each thing that you use has a very distinct navigation and a very distinct purpose. The downside is this is not always a good choice for users who want to multitask. Even though we're typically not very good at multitasking, there are certain situations which sort of demand it, right? I need to be able to go from subtask A to subtask C to subtask F. In some situations that may be warranted. So a hub and spoke model has certain constraints that you have to be aware of. A nested structure is a very linear progression where we go from a very high level to a more detailed level, to an even more detailed level, to an even more detailed level. Okay, and we have the ability to go back to the previous section. This is a very linear way to move to more detailed content. Nesting provides a very quick, very easy method of navigating under stress. Any interactive experience carries with it a certain degree of stress. And I don't mean the bad kind of stress where you're freaked out and under pressure and, nervous and frustrated and agitated. That's not what I mean. There's always a certain degree of stress that's correlated with task completion or goal completion. And that's simply because we have an objective and we're trying to meet it. If a task has a lot of steps, nesting gives us a really strong sense of where we are in the process. It's really good for applications or sites that have either a singular topic or very closely related topics, okay? Because it's easy to see the relationships between things. The downside can be that a nice linear progression, while it's very neat and very easy to execute, can be a barrier to exploring. People won't be able to sort of quickly switch between sections. They're forced to go down a very narrow structured path, and they have to experience A before B, before C, before D. Next, we have a bento box or a dashboard, which everybody I think is pretty familiar with. With a dashboard, you start out in a single location, and then you sort of navigate out into one of many areas. The dashboard model is meant to give you a taste, a sample of what's available in those areas, where you can go, what you can do, and what you can expect to find once you get there. The dashboard pattern displays portions of related tools or content on a main screen. This pattern is much more suited to a desktop or a tablet situation versus mobile, simply because it's complex and because it requires a certain amount of screen real estate to properly stand all this stuff up and give people the indication of what's there, of what they can expect. That sample, the idea of giving them a taste of what's ahead, is really, really important. The dashboard allows the user to get key information at a glance. The kicker is it relies very heavily on a well-designed user interface. A dashboard that's poorly designed will not be used, because it typically will give the user no sense of what's ahead or of what value it is to them. Bad design makes it very difficult to tell one choice from another. And if we can't do that, we really have no sense of what's possible. The dashboard approach is really good for multifunctional tools and content-based tablet apps that have similar themes. The tablet screen gives you more space to utilize this pattern well, as I said a minute ago, simply because you've got more screen real estate. Okay, you've got more to deal with, and it's much easier to give people a solid sense of what's ahead. What's really critical is that you fully understand how that person is going to interact with each piece of content and how they're going to move between each piece of content, okay? Because similar to the hub and spoke model, once you go out, you have to be able to get back, and it's entirely possible that you may have to jump to another subsection as opposed to returning to the home screen. So you got to think hard about how people are going to move between areas of information. Finally, we have what's called a filtered view. This is a pattern that you see a lot on e-commerce sites and in just about any situation where you have to search across very complex sets of information, okay, where once you do a search, then you can sort of narrow it by certain attributes, certain filters. This is a pattern that allows people to use filtering options to create an alternate view of a specific set of information. I did a search and I get my results, and now I want to narrow what I see and what I don't see. It's really good for apps or sites that have a high volume of content. When people know the information set is dense, it's complex, they will almost always go to search as opposed to browse. It can be a really good basis for magazine-style apps or sites, or as a sub-pattern inside another navigational pattern. The issue with taking a filtered view approach is that it can be really difficult to execute on a mobile screen, because exposing all the possible filters, all the possible facets of a search demands screen real estate. You've almost always got a lot of choices, and when your form factor is limited, it's really hard to fit all that stuff on this tiny surface and have it be visible, obvious, and easy to use.